Sunday school leader. I hope you've had a great week so far and hope you had a great lesson last week. But let's look forward because Sunday's coming up. Remember, we're in the unit that's entitled Living by Faith, Women Who Trusted God. This is the 5th lesson. It's called The Poor Widow, Faith That Gives. We're in the New Testament now, looking at Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21, and chapter 21, verses 1 through 4. And the point of the lesson is your giving reflects your faith and trust in Christ. Well, this week we will finish our lesson with a story of a lady of faith. But in the beginning verses of our lesson this week, we see a man who makes a request of Jesus. And Jesus then gives a warning. And then, seeing that this is a great opportunity for a teaching moment, he follows it with a parable. So let's look and see what's going on. So someone asked Jesus, "Teacher," or "Rabbi, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And well, in that time, it was not uncommon for a rabbi, for a teacher to settle disputes. But this was not Jesus's main primary function, his primary mission. How did he reply? He said, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed." Well, when we think of greed, of course, we think of money, and that's legit. But what other kind of greeds are there that we should be aware of? Because it says all kinds of greed. Well, there's the greed for power, for position, for authority, for admiration, for stuff. All these things we need to be on our guard for. And why do we need to be on our guard for that? Well, the Apostle Paul tells us that in Colossians chapter 3, verse 5. He says, "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry." So all those things that Paul listed, including greed, is idolatry, because greed puts your desires ahead of God. And anything that puts something ahead of God, that's idolatry. All right, back to Jesus' statement. He replies with, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Then he finishes it with, life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. See, abundant possessions is not the same. It does not equal abundant life. We have to remember, in that culture, that Jewish mindset, that they believed that if God was truly smiling on you and blessed you, then you would be healthy, you would be well taken care of. And so this is kind of going against that cultural mindset. Well, then he tells this parable, the parable of the rich fool. Your Bible may have that heading. And this rich man had an abundant harvest, and he didn't have any place he had so much grain, he didn't have any place to store it. So he said, what am I going to do? I'm going to tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and then I'll be set. I can just kick back. I'll be set for years. Eat, drink, and be merry. There's one of those phrases that comes right out of the Bible. Well, he may have been rich, but he could not and did not foresee the future, because he was going to die that very night. And what good would all the grain in the world, or bigger barns, or more stuff do for him? What good would it do? Wouldn't do any good at all. Because then someone else is going to inherit that stuff he worked so hard for. Now, if we remember back on March 24th of this year, we were studying Ecclesiastes, and the author of that book had the same problem. He realized, I'm going to have to leave everything I worked so hard for to my descendants. And they might be foolish, and they might squander it. So what good is it? All right, now, so we can see here that this rich guy might have that same kind of problem. And in just 3 verses, this man that Jesus tells this parable, the man uses the words I, me, or myself 10 times in just 3 verses. You can tell he's very centered. He's very centered on self, on stuff, no consideration for God. So this man in this parable had the same consideration for himself and for his plans that James addresses in the book he authored in James chapter 4, verses 13 through 16, where he says, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make profit, yet you don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So, like I said, the man had that same kind of attitude that James addressed there. And we should be careful that, we're planning, we're making our plans, that's okay, but we ought not to get so confident in our plans that we eliminate God out of them. We know that the things that we acquire on this earth will do us no good in eternity, but yet we still covet and we clamor for those gadgets, those newest gadgets of today, don't we? You've heard the phrase, I know you have, he who dies with the most toys wins. Well, let's go back to another lesson this year. February 17th of this year, we did a lesson on materialism, when materialism consumes. And the point of that lesson was that possessions never satisfy or last, but the love of God does. So there again, you can always refer back to these previous lessons, and maybe it'll help tie in some of these thoughts, and maybe will become a little bit more concrete in your students' minds. Okay, then we get down to Luke 21, and this is the real life example of how Jesus thinks people should live. Not that they have to give away everything, but the attitude, okay, the attitude behind it. And what does Jesus say in Luke 21:1? He sees rich people putting their gifts into the treasury, and then what happens? He sees this poor widow come and put 2 small copper coins in. Most of the commentators say that one of these coins is worth less than a fraction of a cent today. But what does Jesus say? That's all she had. And he said kind of an outlandish thing, that she gave more than basically everybody else combined did. And why is that? Because it's not the size of the gift, but it's the size of the sacrifice that Jesus sees. I'll give you an example. 38, whatever it was, 30 something years ago. Don't tell my wife I forgot. Let's see, we were married in 1982, so that's 35, 36 years. This will be our 37th year. 37 years ago, right after we first got married, I was going to college. My wife worked in a Mexican fast food restaurant. She brought home about $50 a week. Now, I know that was 38 years ago, but we gave $5 a week to the church. Now, let's say I could brag and say I tripled that. That's $15 a week I'm giving you the church now. Aren't I good? Well, no, it's not the size of the gift. It's the sacrifice. And for us, that $5 out of that $50 was a sacrifice. But today, $15 a week, to most people, I know there are some people in your church that are struggling, but to most people, that's really nothing. So we have 2 parts to this lesson. We've got Jesus' teaching on the attitude of stuff and giving, and then a real life example of this widow who gave out of her poverty. You could say it's the rich, foolish man versus the poor, wise woman. Now, if you need some supporting verses for this week, I would suggest Matthew 16:26 that says, what good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? We can look over in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21, where Jesus says, don't store up for yourself treasures on earth, but, because moth and rust are going to destroy that, but store up for yourself treasures in heaven. Here's a few miscellaneous thoughts for you. I really think this lesson of Jesus' teaching goes flat dab against the teachings of the prosperity gospel, doesn't it? Now, here's another thought. I have found that the most generous churches tend to be those smaller, poorer churches. I don't know why that is, but that's just what I have found. Here's a thought, a mindset perhaps in the larger church, when I'm sitting there with hundreds of other people and a plea is given for something, that's kind of diluted by the number of people who are there. It can be. And so I can think, well, I can give $1 or $2, and maybe somebody else will give more. But when you're in that smaller congregation and that plea is given, there's more of an immediacy, I think, to the person. So anyway, just a little psychology, I guess, in all that. All right, here's something else you have probably seen. A funeral can bring out the ugly side of people, including their greediness. There's been a lot of movies made where the reading of the will comes about, and that brings out the worst in people, and they scheme and plot against each other to try to get more of their share. All right, and I've already said this, but it's not the size of the gift, but it's the sacrifice that counts. All right. Okay, here's some questions for you to think about. Is planning and saving for the future okay? I think it is. It's to me, that's completely different than this guy in the beginning parable, where he's hoarding. He's not just planning for the future, he's hoarding for himself. All right. What are some ways that we can be rich toward God? Or, as it says in the Sermon on the Mount, to store up treasures in heaven. Also in verse 20, God is talking to this man in the parable and calls him, "You fool." How do we reconcile that with Matthew 5:22? All right. Also, can a church have a greedy mentality? I think they can. What about a Sunday school class? What are some ways that a Sunday school class can have a greedy mentality? You might ask that question, and it might get them to thinking, does our class have a greedy mentality? Are we about ourselves and nobody else? Okay. All right. So next week, we're looking at another unnamed lady. See, this lady this week was not named. We've been looking at other ladies that had their names written down, but this week we didn't. Next week, the same thing. Unnamed lady, looking at the Samaritan woman. All right. Hodgepodge of thoughts today. Hope you have a great week. Don't forget to pray for your class.